an awesome privilege to have with us today Dr. and Mrs. Lejeune, and for us to be able to hear from Dr. Lejeune on these very practical and down-to-earth issues of the beginning of human life at conception. Dr. Jerome Lejeune.
It's dangerous to applaud before. Well, it's a great honor to speak to so distinguished persons. And I would start with a confidence. A funny thing happened to me in my way to Maryville, Tennessee. I had a phone call from my friend Morton Palmer, telling me that there were 7 embryos somewhere in the fridge, and that the mother, after the wreckage of their matrimony, wanted to give the shelter of her own womb to those 7 tiny, early little beings. And he told me, you have to come. And I said, but what said the mother? And he told me, I have read only the newspaper. And the mother said that if she was denied the possibility of giving shelter to her own flesh, she would prefer that the babies, she said the babies, would be given life by another woman, that knowing them to be dead are chilled forever. And I said to Martin, well, it's good, because she said just what decided the Solomon judgment. And you know, Solomon judgment, to the best of my knowledge, happens once in every 3,000 years. And if it happens that one of the Solomon judgment happens in your lifetime, it's worth the trip. That's the only reason why I had the great honor of testifying in Maryville for Mary, who was defended by Kristen Berry, to tell to the court that what was inside the fridge, inside the concentration can, were 7 early human beings, and so to speak, he had not to make a judgment, but to make a statement about a new story which could be called the 7 hopes of Mary. Well, let's make together a trip, not to Maryville, but to that very faraway country of which all of us are coming from. To suppose that human being begins at its own beginning is not a poor opinion matter. It's not a philosophical question. It's not even a religious opinion. It's in fact a scientific question, because it's only when we know what we are talking about that we will make a reasonable opinion, that we will have a philosophical position, and that we can hear a religious teaching. Then when does human life begins? Or more precisely, when does a man begin? We know by all the story of medicine and of biology that there is a material link between generations. Because we know that it's by the fertilization of an ovum by a sperm that's all the genetic information necessary and sufficient to spell out all the quality of this very person who is just beginning to emerge is finally gathered. This link was for centuries not understood at all, and only by inference it should have been there. With the progress of genetics, we know that the link is a material thread, a thread of a molecule that we call DNA. And we know that it is when all the tiny changes inside the DNA coming from father and coming from mother are put together that the whole constitution of a new human being is really spelled out. That's interesting for legislation, that we use the same word to define the nature of a man and the status of a country. We speak about a constitution. And if a man is well built and robust, we say, as doctors, he has a good constitution. And if in a country every person is protected by intelligent law, we say this country has an equitable constitution. And just the same, natural sciences and science of the law are speaking the same language. As legislators, you know that to spell out a law, you have to write it word by word and expressing exactly what you have in your own mind so that this law begin to existence. Secondarily, it has to be voted before it can be enacted. It's exactly the same principle in life. The voting process does exist. It's a choice of one of the sperms among few thousand, maybe 10,000 of them, which are surrounding the egg, so that finally this particular constitution, entirely spelled out in the molecule of the DNA of the sperm and of the egg, is finally enacted, and a new human being begins its career. We have, so to speak, a machine to protect the ballot of the voting process, that is the sperm entry, and we call it the zona pellucida. It's a kind of plastic bag which is around the ovum, and only one sperm can go in, because as soon as it has penetrated inside, then the zona pellucida change. It becomes hermetic to any other sperm, and only that constitution will stay, not forever, but for life of that individual. The miniaturization of the language of life is in fact confounding. I have to give you an idea, and the best would be that if we were gathering here in Chicago, all the long ribbons of DNA which will be contained in the sperm and in the ova, which by their conjunction will spell out the constitution of each and every one of the 5 billions of people which will replace ourselves on the surface of this planet, this quantity of matter would fit neatly in 2 aspirin tablets. That's written in a way which is much smaller than even the best computer system we have now. And there is an obvious constatation that at the very beginning there must be a kind of cross, a kind of mixing, a kind of interaction between energy, matter, and form. And at the very beginning of a new being, soul and body, spirit and matter. And so to speak, genetic information and molecular structure are so intricately interwoven that we use only one term to define the spirit and the matter. The explanation is the following. We use the same word to define an idea coming to our mind or a new baby coming to being, into being. We say conception. We conceive an idea, a baby is conceived. And the fact that we use the same concept of conception, both for the mind and for the animation of the matter, is not a poverty, of the language, of the vocabulary, but it is in fact the description, very precise, of what all genetics is about. Because matter cannot live. Nothing exists like living matter. What exists is a matter animated by an information. And if I had to summarize what I have to do every year to my student in Paris, what is genetics in broad terms, it is very simple. At the beginning, there is a message. This message is in life, and this message is life. And if this message is a human message, this life is a human life. That's the whole of genetics. And probably you recognize that is an awkward paraphrasis of the beginning of a very old book. Normally, conception do occur inside the body of the mother, and you know that the ovary, which is laying one egg every 15 days after the last menses, is linked to the uterus by a kind of tube of flesh, which we call the fallopian tube, and it is inside that tube that the ovule, which is progressively vehiculated by the ciliae on the mucosa, encounter the few thousands of sperms which are indefatigable navigators. They have come up from the vagina through the cervix and then to the whole cavity of the uterus, and they come finally inside the tube, in which the only one cell, the egg, is floating majestuously, and one of them penetrates the zona pellucida, and the new constitution of a new man is now spelled out. But what is really reproduced? How could that be that after the coming together of two cells, a new human being will emerge? Well, to understand that, we have to understand what is reproduction, broadly speaking. I take a very simple example. When you have a statue and you want to reproduce it, you can make a mold, and when you have the mold, on the mold you can inject plaster to have a replica. Now, between the original and the mold, there would be an intimate contact, molecule by molecule, between the original and the mold. And during the casting process, that would be again a molecule-to-molecule contact between the mold and the replicate. But what will be replicated? It's obviously not the matter, because the statue can be of clay, and you can reproduce it in bronze, in iron, in anything. What will be reproduced is not the matter, but it is the information which was imprinted on the statue by the genius of the sculptor. Then matter has been only the support of the information. And it is the information which is reproduced, not the matter. I'll take a more modern example, which would be the one of a tape recorder. But in a tape recorder, you can put a cartridge in which a tape is present, in which, by minute change of the magnetic strength, a kind of code is written, so that if you put it in a reading machine, in a magnetophone, it will restitute by the loudspeaker not the musicians of the orchestra, not the notes of music on their scores, but it will reproduce the movement of the air, which is able to carry to you the genius of Mozart. That is, what has been reproduced, it's really the basic information. It's the same way we can use a magnetoscope to have the picture of a movie. Everything is written on the tape. Even when we record information in a big computer, we use a hard disk, and the only difference is only that instead of a ribbon, we have now the thread in spiral imprinted inside a solid surface. But it's always the same thing. A code is encoding the information, and what is restituted at the end of the process of reproduction is not the matter who was supporting the information, but the information itself, which again now can animate the matter. Now, to give you an idea, a chromosome, which is made of DNA coiled very precisely, is looking like a mini cassette. We have 23 chromosomes, 23 mini cassettes coming from father, 23 coming from mother, and at the moment all the 23 plus 23 makes 46. At that moment, the whole registered human symphony can begin to be played. I said previously that the amount of information was very great. It is very great. And if we were going to print letter by letter what is written by the successive bases in DNA, it would take around 6 times the Encyclopedia Britannica, putting one after the other the 4 letters T, C, G, A, and it would be very boring to read it. Also, the signification is enormous because it's a spelling of a human constitution. Now, life has to use a very miniature language because life is in fact ordering the chance movement of molecule according to the necessity of the being. That's what life is. Now, you can say, well, it's a very abstract definition. Well, we have the counter demonstration of what I say, which is a freezing. When you diminish the temperature, you lower down the temperature, you diminish the speed with which the molecules are moving inside the medium. When you come to the absolute zero at minus 273 Celsius, every movement of the molecule and atoms is stopped. And if an egg, or a fertilized egg, an embryo, was put in this absolute zero, it will say that indefinitely, so to speak, forever, without changing. We are not able to do that in laboratory. Nobody can reach the absolute zero. But we can go to very deep frozen. We don't use liquid hydrogen, which is very close to the zero, but which is very explosive and very costly. It is used for the rockets of the NASA, but not in laboratory for biology. It's too costly for us. We use liquid nitrogen. Does not cost very much, not toxic, does not explode, but it's only minus 180. It's pretty cool, but nevertheless, it's not the real standstill. Now, what happens is that if you have frozen carefully the living system so that its information by the structure of the molecule has not been destroyed by crystal of ice inside it, it has been preserved, then if you tow it very gently, the flux of the movement of the molecule will again allow the manifestation of life. Then what has happened? If life had been arrested, it won't start again. What was happening inside the bottle, inside the liquid nitrogen, is that time was slowed down so that finally time was frozen. And when we put by thousands tiny human embryos inside a big can that size, in which we have put liquid nitrogen, they are surviving in a, so to speak, suspended time. They are concentrated in the can in which time itself is arrested. And I use the word concentration can to explain that in Maryville. The judge understood very well. But some newspaper did not understood, and they published concentration camp. Well, it's an interesting mistake, because concentration camp have been invented to speed up terribly death. And concentration can has been invented to slow down terribly life. But in both cases, there are innocents which are subjected to concentration state. Let's come back to a better temperature, to the warmth of the human body, to the warmth of the womb. This kind of secret temple which is inside the female body. The first time I used that word, secret temple, it was to explain what was the womb to a very nice assembly of Japanese nuns. And I wanted to tell them something they could really realize. And suddenly, la supérieure told to the translator, he speaks good Japanese. Indeed, I don't know a word of Japanese. And then she said, you have to tell him something. In Japanese, to write down uterus, we use two kanjis. One means aether, temple, or palace. And the other kanji means aether, baby, or concealed. The palace of the baby of the secret temple. It's very interesting that it does not matter whether human beings are talking Japanese, French, or English. When they are coming to the very beginning, it's always something about secret and sacred, which comes to their lips if it comes from their heart. Well, let's come back now. We are now on the normal. And the fertilized egg is now splitting in 2 cells. I've been very surprised that our colleagues from England have invented a new word to speak about this stage. And they speak about a pre-embryo. Very curious. Because when you look at Encyclopedia Britannica, this word does not exist. It does not exist in the Little Webster. It does not exist in French dictionary. Then I went to the encyclopedia I have to my great father, and which was printed 60 years ago. And the definition of embryo is very simple: the youngest form of a being. That's clear. It's what has been used in genetics and in embryology from the very beginning. And we don't need a new word, pre-embryo, because before the embryo, there is only 2 cells, 1 egg, 1 sperm. But if that sperm is not going on that egg, no embryo exists. So nothing like a pre-embryo can exist, because before the embryo, there is nothing. Now, why do they try to twist language? It's because they believe that if you tell to the people it's a pre-embryo, well, you can use that embryo without the people realizing that it is an embryo. They would believe it's a pre-embryo, not knowing what it means. What it means, it's very interesting. Because after it had split in 2 cells, then it splits in 3 cells. We were expecting it would do 2, 4, 8, 16, and so on. It does not do that in nature. And apparently, there is some discussion between the 3 cells. We know that by experiment in mice. And suddenly they realize we are not a collection of cells, because in my lab we have a lot of culture of cells which are taken from the body, and never a baby is coming out in the incubator. But in the very beginning, when they had the 3-cell stage, some click, some transmission of information between those 3 cells occurs, and they decide we are an individual. And I said we know that by experiment in mice, because we cannot mix more than 3 cell line to have 1 embryo. In mice, you can take cells from 1 embryo or from another one, mix them together in a zona pellucida, and see what comes out. It comes out a little mice. If you have taken a black embryo, a white embryo, she has a chessboard on the fur, because she has place from black and place from white. You can do it with 3 different embryos, but with 4 it does not work. Only 3 lines can be used to make 1 individual. That means that this stage of 3 cells, which just follow the first division, is an individuation system. And it's very curious to see that you need a trinity to define 1 hypostasis. If we look at the development, it will take 9 months, and it will be too long for this talk. But I would only say that at 2 months, if I had a young human in my fist, you would not notice that I have anything in my hand. It's very small. It has grown enormously, but it's still 2.5 centimeters from the crown to the rump. But if I was opening my hand, you would see a tiny little human being that nobody would mistake with a fetus of chimpanzee of 2 months, with a fetus of gorilla of 2 months, with a fetus of orangutan of 2 months of age. Nobody. Everybody would say, this one is a man. That's the reason why at that time, at 2 months of age, we changed the name. is not any longer called an embryo, but because everyone can recognize him, we call him a fetus, which meant something to be carried. That's the meaning of the word in Latin. And it will begin to increase the size of the body, the size of the brain, the size of the heart, the size of everything. But everything is already there. Even its nervous system gives him a sensitivity, and sensitivity begins at 2 months of age on the upper lip. It's the first place which can realize touch. The reason is very simple. It's because nature is preparing for finding the nipple 7 months later. And if you look at him at 2 months and a half, he spends most of the time finding his thumb and suckling it so that he can learn how to suckle when he will be born 6 months and a half later. Well, this whole life is very charming to describe. I'm not going to do that. Just let us tell me one word. That inside the uterus, the tiny one, after 2 months, begin to move very rapidly, but mother does not feel anything. Because the amniotic sac is so big compared to the tiny one that he can jump inside without the mother knowing it. But he makes somerset, something that it will take another 4 years when he is breathing the air to be able to do it again. And the first picture we have of an eminent performer of dance was of a tiny lady, 11 weeks of age, who was playing trampoline inside the body of her mother. We knew it was theoretically possible, and we needed to have the system of echography, equivalent to the one used to look at the submarine, to see it recorded on films. Now, I told you at the beginning that the whole information, the whole human constitution was there. You believe it or not, it's not a matter of opinion, because it is demonstrated. And you can get yourself the demonstration. When I can, I visit 2 places in new towns. One is the university, a very interesting place, and the other is a zoological garden, very instructive as well. And the university have met very frequently gathering of very learned people, shaking their head, asking themselves whether their own children, when they are very young, were not some kind of animals. I have never seen in a zoo a congress of chimpanzees asking themselves whether everything being said and done, their children would not someday become academicians. It's a simple experiment. You can do it. And you will notice, as I did, that human nature exists, really, even without having to use a microscope or a molecule analyzer to recognize it. By the way, there exists on the opposite side of the Earth a very curious species of very silly bipeds down there in Australia. They are very big, just as big as we are, and they are as silly that they expel the young one at around 2 months of age, and they consider this abortion being totally normal. I'm speaking about kangaroos. Kangaroos are very poor animals, but the little one has been endowed by nature by only one feeling. He feels gravity. And when the mother had got the abortion, the tiny sausage, which is the size of my thumb, which has very small legs with one claw at the end of it, climb vertically on the fur. So by necessity, he reaches the pouch, falls inside, find a tiny nipple, and get it for another 7 months, so that 7 months, so that it will go out of the pouch at the same age as a human being would. Now, the reason why I tell you that, it's because nature has wired in the meager brain of a kangaroo mother the kangarooiness of this tiny sausage, because it's the only animal she lets go in the pouch. She would reject any other. So that I cannot believe that nature has taken the pain of giving the power to the poor mother kangaroo to recognize that the tiny one is a kangaroo, and that with our 1.5 liters of brain, we human beings would not be able to recognize that tiny human beings are human beings. Let me finish with science. May I speak another 5 minutes? Maybe 10. No, 5. Well, you know, science is long. It took years to know what I'm talking about. So I would say that with the last discovery we have at hand, we have now the demonstration of 2 things. The first is every human is unique. And this uniqueness is demonstrated by the recent discovery by Jeffries that you can look at the DNA inside one cell, thanks to another discovery with the PCR. I don't say that. I don't talk about it. It's too long. But Jeffries' system is you digest the DNA, you spread it with an electric device on a long surface, and you mark different part of that DNA. The result is very interesting, and you can understand immediately what it means, because it's exactly the same as a barcode you get in a supermarket. You know that now they don't put a tag with a price, but they have a little string of lines of various widths, of various distance from each other. They read it with an electronic device, and it tells to the computer what's the price, what's the name of the article, when they should have another one bought, and that. Well, what is interesting, that with the Jeffries investigation, we get the barcode of this person, and reading it with an electronic device, we can demonstrate there is no other barcode just identical to that one. Anyone has his own barcode. The only difference with the computer in the supermarket is that it tells us exactly the name, so to speak, the DNA genetic name of the person, but it does not give the price of human life, because human life has no price. The second discovery, which is also from the last 2 years, has been made by Mr. Surani. It demonstrated something which was known for years but totally ununderstood, that contribution of the father is not entirely homologous to the contribution of the mother. That is, for each chromosome we receive one exemplar of mother, one exemplar of father, and they were supposed to be exactly homologous. They are. What is written in the DNA is just the same, while with the minute changes which makes the personality of each of us. But what was the discovery of Surani was, in fact, in the sperm, during the manufacture of the reproductive cell, father imprint something else on the chromosome by what we call methylation, that is putting a tiny bit of molecule we call a methyl on certain places of DNA. So to speak, father is like a good reader. He is underlining some interesting paragraphs or crossing some other. Mother does the same. On the egg, she's underlying some paragraphs, she's crossing others. But what is the surprise? That they are not underlying the same thing and they are not crossing the same thing. So that on a chromosome received from father, what will be written by the first cell is not the same paragraph, the same definition of the dictionary of what will be written inside the chromosome coming from mother. And that explains a fantastic experiment, which is the following. In mice, you can have an embryo. It is a fecundated egg, a new zygote. Because it's a mice, you can experiment on it. You can extract the legitimate nucleus and, for example, put 2 heads of sperms instead. So you will have the full lot of chromosomes, for the right numbers of chromosomes, but all of them from paternal origin. And it does not give a little mouse. You can do it the same with 2 eggs, with 2 nuclei of eggs in a zygote of which you have expelled the legitimate nucleus. It does not give a little mice. But if you mix them together, it gives a mice. So it's a proof that you need the information coming both from father and mother. But what is interesting, that you can mark by genetic marker the male cells, the male chromosome from the female chromosome, and you will find that the cells in those monstrous chimeric mice, which are coming from father, are going to the annexes. It makes an amniotic bag, it makes a placenta. And those coming from mother, they build the little one. So that we know now from those experiments, which are a little difficult to explain to you, in plain terms, the following fact, that at fecundation, some part of our chromosome coming from father the placenta to get the food. And now what tell to the little embryo the chromosome coming from mother is how to make the spare pieces to build the baby. And it's very bewildering that at the very beginning of our own life, the repartition of the task between male and female is already there. Male should get the food and mother should feed the baby. And we knew that for a long time, because we knew that if by misfortune at the moment of fecundation the female pronucleus was dying and there were 2 sperms inside, there was normal number of chromosomes, it was making only cysts and something we call hydatiformis mole, a dangerous thing because it can be a cancer, which we call very dangerous, chorioepithelioma, very dangerous for the mother. On the contrary, on a young girl, sometime one egg begins to divide. It cannot produce a baby if she is a virgin, but it can produce the spare pieces. It makes bits of skin, bits of teeth, bits of nail, bits of hair, bits of neurons, but no baby. That's very interesting, because again we know it's due to the underlining, the differential underlining in male and female sexes. The conclusion is, at the very beginning, the spelling of the Constitution is using not only everything which is written on DNA, but it has changed the DNA to tell you read that first. And I, your father, I tell you, you begin to make the hut. And mother tell us, you begin to make your blood. But the other conclusion is, I think, the most impressive for the newspaper men, if there are some of them here, that we know with this discovery of Surani that it's no longer possible to make clones. It's no longer necessary to talk about whether it will be allowed to take one egg from an homosexual woman and have it fecundated by a cell of another woman. It's no longer interesting to talk about whether you could do the same thing with the head of a sperm included twice in an egg. The reproduction, the clonal reproduction, is not possible in our species. We did not know that 2 years ago. Well, I was guessing it was not an easy way, but to demonstrate it was not possible was not available. Now, with the marking of the DNA, we know that we are back to dad and mom. It cannot be made the other way. Human beings have to be made by a sperm and an egg, otherwise they cannot be made at all. To finish, I would just say to you that I was extremely honored to speak in Maryville. Now today to speak here in Chicago to Legislator, I feel even more impressed because in Maryville, a judge, Mr. Young, gave the same conclusion that 3,000 years before Solomon had reached, which was considered as the paragon of justice. I hope that when you are back in your state, you again will be on the side of Solomon.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor. We now are going to take some questions from the audience, and we have the mic, so why don't you perhaps come to the center aisle to make it a little more convenient, and we'll pass the mic to you. I have a call from for Brian Young. It's an urgent call to call Chris Moon. So who's our first question?
Doctor, it seems to me that the biggest debate now will be, the idea of when does life begin, as you've been talking about. And for those who are starting to use sort of a new approach and talking about using the same criteria for beginning of life as the end of life, how would you advise us to discuss that, the conception idea versus the 8 weeks with the beginning of the brain waves and the heartbeat and so forth? How would we differentiate between the two?
The difference is very simple. It depends what you are talking about. I took the example of the symphony on a mini cassette. Now let's suppose you are listening to the Kleine Nachtmusik. If you are a music lover, you put the cartridge, and after the second bar, you say it's Mozart. After the fifth one, you say, oh, it's a Kleine Nachtmusik. But if you have never heard a symphony, that symphony, you have to have it spelled out entirely before you can say, well, it was a Kleine Nachtmusik. That's the same thing with human life. Some people will tell you, I will not recognize it as a human life before there is a nervous system, before I can feel something surely. And it takes 1.5 months to 2 months. It starts with the upper lips. Now, another would tell you, I won't believe it's a human being before it can breathe alone outside bother. That's so-called viability. That takes around, depending upon the equipment you have in the hospital, between 7 months and 5 months, depending if you are a good hospital or a bad one. A bad one, it takes 7 months. A good one, it takes 5. Probably in a very good one, in another year, it will take 4 months. So the limit depends on the intelligence, the knowledge of the one who makes the diagnosis. Now, other will tell you, I won't believe it's a human being until he can stay and tell me I am a man. It takes around 7 years. Another would tell you, I won't believe it's a man before it can vote. It depends on the country. Then it means that the question is not when a human being begins, but when the people you are talking with begin to understand that it is a human being. Now, when they equate it with the end of life, that does not work at all. Because what we diagnose at the end of life, it's the definite abandon of hope that this person can survive. Then we need a flat electroencephalogram, all that stuff, to tell us, well, he cannot live any longer. Now, in the embryo, it's entirely the contrary. We know from the very beginning that he will live a whole life if we don't kill him. So you cannot use the same concept that we're using for defining death, because what you are defining now is not death, it's life. I think, to the best of my knowledge, no one of my colleagues, either biologists or doctors, believe anything about splitting the early life in various stages in which before that it was not a human being, after that it's a human being. No one of them believe that. But they talk about it to make believe.
Doctor, it seems almost paradoxical that at this stage of scientific development in the human race, when we know most about the development of the human being, that we have the largest number of abortions in the history of the world.
Yeah.
Is this a function of ideology, what Max Picard once called the flight from God? Could you speculate on that?
I think it's brainwashing. Our generation has been brainwashed. Because, as far as I can understand, never a woman has believed that what it was growing in her womb was anything else than a tiny human being. They have never believed it. And they still don't. But there are people who want to destroy early human beings for a very precise reason that you have to know. That has happened around 15 years ago at the beginning of the campaign for abortion in France. And there was a big gathering of only press people. It was in Royaumont Abbey. And one lady rose. She refused to say her name, to say the association she was talking of, but she said, we want to destroy the Judeo-Christian civilization. To destroy it, we have to destroy family. To destroy family, we have to attack it in its weakest link. Its weakest link is a child not yet born. Hence, we are for abortion. She said nothing more than that. No one of the 50 newsmen wrote any word about what she had said. What she had said was of an utmost importance, because it explained why all those discussions are loaded with sometimes hatred, not on our side, but on the other side, who want to destroy something through the children. Now, I would say that we are living in a time in which schizophrenia is the greatest danger. There are two great dangers of war to humanity: the chemical warfare and the atomic warfare. Chemical warfare against humanity is just started, and I'm afraid it started in my country. The pill, the abortion pill, RU 486, is the first binary ammunition to kill specifically a certain class of human beings, those who are not yet born. Is the first anti-human pesticide. If it is used against humanity, if it is manufactured industrially, I can venture without any risk of mistake that it will kill more people than did previously Hitler, Mao Zedong, and Stalin together. This is an enormous risk. It is the chemical warfare against tiny human beings. You have to prevent that in your country. But the second one, which is just as big, is the atomic warfare. And it is directly related to abortion for a very simple physiological reason. If grown-up, big Americans are allowed to kill their own children, their own flesh, legally, if big Russians do the same with an equivalent law in their country, how will you able to convince big American and big Russian that they should not kill their adversary at the moment it's lawful to kill their own children? It's schizophrenic to believe that you can have two countries going to peace if they are at war against their own children.
I think we need to stop after every sentence or two and just think about some of these things, I'll tell you. All right, let's have another question. Yes, sir.
Doctor, could you just explain biologically what happens with the abortion pill, and does it work for any period during the 9 months, or at some point that it is no longer effective?
It's very difficult to answer that because they refuse to talk about it. What does that pill is to prevent progesterone, which is a normal hormone which allows the baby to be accepted inside the woman's body. It prevents that hormone of acting. So they propose to kill the baby by the blood flow between 1 month of age of the baby up to maybe 2 months of age. But they don't tell you that if you do it at 3 months of pregnancy, at 4 months of pregnancy, you can as well produce abortion, but with less certainty that some more baby would survive than if they do it very early, and will probably survive with severe damage. That's not published. I have no data to that. And they refuse to speak about that because they know that if that pill is given under the counter, the number of disasters which will happen, they cannot measure it.